So you know how sometimes you hear a government project name and you just immediately know something's messed up? Like when the CIA named their mind control experiments MK Ultra. They have a real knack for subtlety there. Well, today we're talking about a project with possibly the most ironic name in Cold War history, Project Sunshine. And before you think this is about solar panels or renewable energy or some wholesome garbage like that, no. This is the US government we're talking about. And this is about the US government secretly collecting dead babies to measure how much radiation from nuclear bombs was getting into human bones. Project Sunshine, a program so ethically questionable that when it became public in the 1990s, multiple countries launched investigations, families demanded answers, and the whole thing became a textbook example of just because you can do something in the name of science doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
But here's the thing. The story's complicated because while the methods were absolutely horrifying, the question they were trying to answer was genuinely important. Hey, we've been detonating nuclear weapons in the atmosphere almost weekly for a decade. Are we accidentally killing everyone with radioactive fallout? And yeah, they kind of were. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. So grab a coffee, grab a beer, or your emotional support beverage of choice, because we're about to talk about one of the most disturbing scientific programs of recent history. And that's saying a lot. Dude, a little decency? All right, so to understand why Project Sunshine even happened, we need to set the scene. It's the early 1950s. World War II just ended, and the Cold War is heating up faster than the inside of pizza rolls when you put them in the microwave. And the United States and the Soviet Union are in an arms race that makes modern military spending look like a bake sale. And both sides have the same brilliant idea. You know what would make us safer? Testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. Like, a lot of them. I mean, a lot of them. Like, between 1945 and 1963, over 500 atmospheric nuclear tests. Yes, 500 nuclear bombs detonated in open air. The US alone conducted over 200 of these tests. We were setting off nukes more often than some people go to the gym, myself included. Now, when you detonate a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere, it doesn't just make a big boom and then everything's fine. It creates radioactive particulates, fallout. It gets swept up into the atmosphere, and then, well, everything that goes up must come back down. They come down everywhere, in rain, in snow, in dust. It's literally global. And one particular isotope that was causing concern among scientists and eventually everyone, strontium-90. Strontium-90 is nasty stuff. It's a radioactive isotope produced by nuclear fission. It has a half-life of about 29 years. But here's the kicker. It's chemically similar to calcium. In fact, it's considered a bone seeker. So when it gets into your body looks at it and goes, that's calcium, and your bones absorb it. Except it's not calcium, it's radioactive strontium that's now irradiating you from the inside from your own skeleton. Yeah, lovely. And guess who has bones that are rapidly developing and constantly absorbing calcium and calcium-like substances? Children. Especially babies. Yeah, that's where this is going. So by the early 1950s, some scientists were starting to ask a very reasonable question of, hey guys, are we maybe poisoning every child on Earth with our nuclear testing? Enter Project Gabriel in 1951. This was an earlier study that basically confirmed everyone's worst fears that, yes, strontium-90 from nuclear testing was spreading globally. And yes, it was concentrating in children's bones. And yes, this was pretty bad. The Atomic Energy Commission, or the AEC, basically the guys in charge of nuclear stuff in America, went, well, shit, how bad is it? And they needed to find more data to figure out how bad. And thus, in 1953, Project Sunshine was born. The name, by the way, came from the idea that radioactive fallout was now as ubiquitous as sunshine. Because nothing says sunshine and happiness like global radioactive contamination. The project was led by one Willard Libby, who would later win a Nobel Prize for his work on carbon dating. Smart guy. Really smart. Apparently smart and ethical don't always come in the same package. The goal of Project Sunshine was simple: measure the amount of strontium-90 in human tissue, specifically human bones, from around the world to understand how much fallout was actually getting into people. The problem, you need human tissue to study, preferably from young people and babies, since their rapidly growing bones would show the highest concentration of strontium-90. And the solution they came up with, let's just say, it wasn't great. The researchers at Project Sunshine decided they needed to collect bone samples from deceased infants and young children around the world. When I say around the world, I mean around the world. They collected samples from the US, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, Hong Kong, Europe, you name it. And now you might be thinking, okay, but they asked the parents for permission, right? They explained what they were doing first. Oh, you sweet, sweet, innocent summer child. This is the government we're talking about. Of course they didn't. Documents declassified in the 1990s revealed that researchers used what they called back channels to obtain bodies. They worked with pathologists, hospitals, and intermediaries who had access to deceased infants, including stillborn babies, and collected tissue samples without proper consent from just about anybody. A 1955 memo on the project specifically literally discussed their body procurement program and mentioned they had people in cities like Vancouver, Houston, and New York that could get them what they needed. And let me be crystal clear about what this means. Parents who had just lost a baby, one of the most traumatic experiences a human can go through, had their child's body parts taken and removed and cremated for testing. And they were never told. In most cases, never even asked about it. And in some cases, weren't even allowed to see or touch their deceased child's body before burial. And between 1953 and 1958, over 1,500 samples were collected. Yes, that is 1,500, 1,500. The annual report in 1955 to 1956 showed that Vancouver alone provided 127 human bone samples out of 1,300 collected globally that year. And it wasn't just dead bodies. They also collected placentas from living births, milk samples from nursing mothers, and even analyzed bones of people who had died of various causes to get a cross-section of ages and demographics. The project was initially classified as secret. The public had no idea this was happening, and it wasn't until 1956 that some aspects of the research were published. But even then, the full extent of the program, especially the collection methods, remained hidden for decades. Now, here's the thing. As ethically abhorrent as the methods were, the science itself was important, and the findings were significant. Project Sunshine confirmed that strontium-90 from nuclear testing was indeed entering the human body through the food chain. It concentrated in milk, crops, and eventually made its way into human bones. The research showed that children born in the 1950s had measurable amounts of strontium-90 in their bodies, radiation that wasn't there before nuclear testing began. The data helped establish the connection between atmospheric nuclear testing and environmental contamination. It provided hard evidence that fallout wasn't just a theoretical concern, it was a real, ongoing, measurable threat to public health. This research, along with growing public awareness and concern about nuclear testing, contributed to the push for the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which banned atmospheric nuclear testing outright. That single treaty probably saved countless lives by moving nuclear tests underground. So in some twisted, fucked up way, Project Sunshine's findings helped protect future generations from radiation exposure. But that doesn't make what they did okay. Not even close. For decades, the full story of Project Sunshine remained buried in classified documents. Families had no idea that their children's bodies had been used for research. The scientists involved moved on with their careers. Willard Libby, again, won a Nobel Prize in 1960. And then in 1994, President Bill Clinton, yes, that President Clinton, ordered an investigation into the Cold War era radiation experiments. The Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments was formed to dig through thousands of classified documents and figure out what the hell had actually been going on. When they released their findings in 1995, Project Sunshine was among the programs they examined. The committee found that researchers had used deception to obtain bone samples from recently deceased babies, and that proper consent had not been obtained from families. The revelation sparked international outrage. Australia launched an investigation. The UK started looking into their involvement. Hong Kong had demanded answers. Canada, too. Families who had lost children decades earlier suddenly learned that their babies had been part of some secret underground government experiments. The committee concluded that in the end, while the research itself had scientific merit and contributed to important public health findings, the methods were ethically unacceptable, even by the standards of the time. Some defenders do argue and have argued that the disposal procedures for human remains were different back then, and what they did wasn't technically illegal at the time, which in most cases is probably true. But it also misses the point completely. Just because it's legal doesn't make it right, and taking someone's dead child for experiments without telling them is about as wrong as it gets. So, what do we take away from all this? Project Sunshine is one of those stories that perfectly encapsulates the ethical quagmire that was the Cold War. Here you had scientists that genuinely believed they were doing important work, and they were. The question of whether nuclear testing is poisoning the human race was not a trivial one, but they were so focused on the importance of the science, on the research, and so caught up in the urgency of the Cold War, they completely steamrolled over basic human dignity, human rights, and ethical norms. They treated deceased children like raw materials for research. They deceived grieving families, and they prioritized data collection over their own humanity. And they did it all in secret because they knew if people found out, there'd be hell to pay. And the really messed up part is they were right to think that. When the truth came out decades later, people were rightfully horrified and angry. This is why we have institutional review boards now, why there are strict protocols for human research, why informed consent isn't a suggestion, it's a fundamental requirement of human research. Because history has shown us over and over again that when scientists operate in secret without oversight, bad things happen. The researchers involved in Project Sunshine weren't cartoon villains twirling their mustaches. They were respected scientists who convinced themselves that the ends justified the means, that the importance of understanding radiation exposure outweighed the rights of deceased children and their families. And they were wrong. No amount of scientific importance justifies what they did. You don't get to sacrifice ethics on the altar of knowledge, no matter how urgent the question. So yeah, Project Sunshine, possibly the most ironically named government program in history. A program that provided important data about nuclear fallout while simultaneously showing us exactly how far scientists were willing to go when they operated without ethical constraints. The good news, research did contribute to ending atmospheric nuclear testing, which probably saved millions of lives from radiation exposure. The bad news, it came at the cost of treating some of the most vulnerable members of society, dead kids, as nothing more than research specimens and deceiving the grieving families of those children in the process. It stands as a somber reminder that scientists without ethics isn't progress. It's just cruelty that you wrote down on a clipboard. If you found this story as disturbing and fascinating as I did, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into weird, dark, complicated corners that will be sometimes conspiracy theories that are true, random things in history. And, leave a comment. Am I being too harsh on the scientists? What do you think here? What's the ethical boundaries of this? I'd love to hear your responses. Thanks for watching. And remember, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. I'll catch you in the next one.